Anne is a natural dyer and textile artist based in DC. Her focus is in color experimentation, surface design, and education. Most recently, Anne participated in the Natural Dye Initiative at MICA in Baltimore, where she has met a wonderful group of artists who have helped shape the way she approaches natural dyeing as a practice. She is part of a textile collective from DC called To Dye For Collective. Before I pass things over to Anne, we are going to go ahead and share a quick poll with all of you. If you'll just give me a moment while I get that published for you. There we go. So we are wondering, what is your experience level with natural dyes? No experience, medium experience, very experienced. If you let us know, then Anne will have a better sense of who we're engaging with today. And with that, I will pass things over to you, Anne.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for the intro. I'm super excited today to talk about indigo, which is one of my favorite dyes to work with. I would love to know what everyone's experience is generally with natural dye, and kind of get a sense of where everyone is meeting us today, and just kind of know how much information and knowledge everyone's coming to the table with.
So, Anne, I can tell you that we've got about 70% of the audience saying they have no experience, and 30% medium experienced, and nobody saying very experienced. So, we are definitely on the early to middle end of the experience spectrum.
Same. I think I also feel like I'm constantly learning, and every single time I come to the dye pot or to a new project, I'm learning something new. So yeah, I would not even say I'm very experienced. I'd say I'm also maybe medium experienced, just because I feel like I'm constantly trying to learn and just take in new information constantly. Okay, well, today we're going to focus on indigo. I wanted to first show you some indigo that I have actually grown in my garden. I live in DC, which I have very little to almost no outdoor space. I actually have a tiny little parking spot behind my building that has a sliver of dirt, which I converted to a dye garden. I was really excited, I think, during the quarantine, to be able to sort of have that space and transform it into something that was beautiful, functional in terms of having dye plants, and also just diving into the gardening aspect of my dye practice, because it's not something that I've ever done before, and being able to open my eyes to that was really incredible. So the indigo plant here, you can see it's already gone to flower, these little pink flowers, but I just plucked these from my garden this morning. These actually self-seeded from last year. So I actually received these plants from Blue Light Junction, which is a lovely studio, natural dye studio based in Baltimore. My friend Kenya is an incredible grower, so knowledgeable about dyes, and she's the one that provided me with these plants from last year. Shockingly, they came back. I didn't do anything this season. They just came back and full force. Awesome. So many awesome indigo plants from it. You can see it almost looks like basil. It has these big green leaves, and it's not what a lot of people expect. When I teach a lot of beginner dye classes, people kind of anticipate that indigo comes from a blue plant or that it has blue flowers, but that's not the case at all. The indigo pigment actually lives inside of these large green leaves, and has to be processed in a special way in order to extract that blue color, which is what we'll talk about today. One of the methods of which we'll talk about today. If anyone, I kind of wanted to know if anyone was interested in growing indigo, or if anyone has grown indigo before. So if you jump over to the polls, I would love to kind of get a sense of where everyone stands with that. Mostly because I am a novice grower, and I'd love to kind of get everyone else's stage in this, because I know a lot of people come to natural dyes because they're interested in growing plants or using plants from their garden.
Okay, so we are, the numbers are changing quickly as people are responding, but we're around 60 to 70% say yes, they have tried to grow
Oh,
indigo. Somewhere around 30% are saying maybe it seems challenging, and at least one of our friends does not feel they have a green thumb. And believe me, we understand that too.
I definitely understand that. But I think that's what's so amazing about this particular type of indigo. This is Japanese indigo that I received from my friends. And what I was shocked by is the fact that it has self seeded and come back this season. Um, I noticed that it is incredibly easy to grow. I just put it down on the ground and it almost grows as easily as something like an herb, like a basil. What I think is really awesome about this particular type of indigo um, is that what I learned from Blue Light Junction and their farm up in Baltimore is that you can harvest this indigo 3 times within a season. And so one of the first things that I did last season in the summer was go up to the farm after they planted these particular indigo plants, and um, I think it was probably in July during like really hot season. We cut down the indigo. It grows to maybe about the height of your knees. I'm short. I'm 5'3", so up to my knees at least. And we would cut them down to the very, very bottom of the base of the plant. And within a month, or I don't even know, 6 weeks, the plant had already grown back to its full height. So it's really incredible that you can get 3 harvests with this indigo plant. So I highly recommend it. What I think is also incredible is that my plot of land behind my parking spot is so small. The soil is, I don't think it's good soil. It's just DC, whatever existed there, and the plant thrived. So I highly recommend anyone who's interested in growing Japanese indigo to pursue it. You can also grow it in containers, which I think is really awesome. So for someone like me who lives in the city, that's a huge benefit. And the lovely thing about having fresh indigo is that not only can the amount that I'm growing isn't necessarily great for a large amount of is not necessarily translatable to a huge vat, but I can use the fresh leaf to extract color on protein fiber. So I wanted to show, while we're talking about the plant and the fresh leaves, an example of a fresh leaf extraction. So if you look at this color here, it's this really lovely shade of aquamarine blue. It's almost like a teal ocean blue. And it's specifically on silk fabric. So one of the things I really love to do with this fresh leaf, and I've done it maybe twice this season, and it was a really awesome experiment in fresh leaf extraction, is you can take all of these fresh leaves, put it into a blender with ice and cold water, blend it so that it's almost like a smoothie, watery pesto consistency, and you can massage silk fabric into that solution and get these really lovely shades of teal blue. So it's a really great use of fresh leaf indigo, especially small quantities of the fresh plant. And it's something that I have been really interested in doing this past season, particularly. And it's a really nice alternative to those deep, rich, saturated dark blues that we see and typically think of that come from an indigo vat. So I just want to give you a little bit of encouragement and hope that for those of you who have already grown it, keep doing it. And for those of you who said maybe seems a little bit challenging, had a lot of really great success and just feel really fulfilled in being able to see the indigo grow from seed to harvesting it and doing something like the fresh leaf extract. So this is something that I highly recommend, and especially now as we are coming to the end of the season, thinking about next season already, something to consider.
And when you are doing a fresh extraction like that, first of all, are you using the leaves and the flowers, or are you just using the leaves?
That's a great question. So with the indigo plant, you only are going to use the leaves. The flowers, once the plant has gone to flower, the blue pigment actually I think is like the plant yields less blue pigment, I should say, and so you want to get these leaves before it's, I guess technically the word, before it flowers, and you would just pluck all of the leaves off like this. I have a little spider web on mine, it's a little sticky. So almost like you're picking herbs, and you would just use the leaves. So I would just take all of these leaves, put it into a blender, and then blend it with ice and water. When I did this experiment, probably early in July or August, I cut about 20 stems of indigo and made about 8 samples of silk. And these are about maybe 8 inches by 8 inches. So, it wasn't that many stems of indigo, and it yielded quite a bit of color.
And is there a difference in the light fastness or wash fastness of color from the fresh dye versus the deeper dye bath?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to tell you, like, I haven't done a specific light fastness, color fastness test with these samples yet. But these have just been sort of laying out in my studio in the full direct sun. And I can say that the color for this has not faded significantly, but it has only been since July. That would be a really great experiment though. And if you do want to do a light fast color fastness test, what I would do is I would probably pull a sample of this, like cut a strip of this, and I can tape it to my window. I can cover half of it with paper and leave the other half exposed to the light, tape it to my window and see how it changes over time. And that's something that's like a best practice with a lot of things that you dye, especially if you're considering pursuing, the same color, trying to go after the same particular shade. Those light tests are really crucial and really helpful. I have not done it though, so I would have to report back. Okay, great. So I wanted to jump in and just sort of talk a little bit about the process. I know that I'm sure a lot of people here are interested in learning how to make their own vats at home. Again, this is something relative to other dyers that I've known or met. This is maybe newer in my practice. I've been working with indigo probably for 4 or 5 years now, but I still feel like every time I come to a new vat, I'm learning something new or meeting other dyers and kind of seeing how their process works, or how someone else might approach an indigo vat. I say that to bring up the fact that in the dyeing world, in natural dyes, natural dye practice, there's just so many different ways and approaches to making a vat, to preparing fabric. And there are certainly more wrong ways of doing things, but there are also just like such a wide variety of methods and approaches. So I'm going to recommend one of the processes that I have found works for me, but I highly recommend everyone going and doing their own research. I can give you a list of resources at the end of this of other dyers that I really respect and have learned from. And you can sort of dive into the process on your own to kind of see what works for you. But this particular process and method today that we'll talk about is something that I think resonates with me. But that being said, I just want you all to be aware that there are so many different ways that you can come to making a vat, come to preparing fabric, etc. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit more about the process. So the method that we're going to talk about today, and I think everyone is expecting to learn about today, is the 1, 2, 3 method of creating a vat. Specifically, the style that I do is a mineral vat. This method was sort of introduced to dyers by a dyer named Michelle Garcia. And for those of you who have done some reading on Natural dyes, you may recognize that name. He is a very prominent dyer that I think is pretty known for this particular style of creating indigo vats. I love indigo so much. This is an example of a workshop that I've done in the past. And you can kind of see the wide spectrum of shades of blue. Also the different types of patterns that we dove into. There's so many different ways and ways that indigo can come across. So you can see some people doing more solid pieces. Some people really working with smaller, intricate patterns that are more geometric. Others are doing pieces that have more of that like classic tie-dye aesthetic of just sort of organic, loose shapes and patterns. Notably here, I think, is also the different shades. So on the far left, you see a very light shade of blue. On the center, you can see some people that did really deep, dark blues. The way that indigo works is that blue is actually built through a series of dips in the vat, and that blue is actually created by the number of dips. So the more dips that you do into the vat, the darker that blue gets. One dip in the vat probably gets you something on the left side, which is a very light kind of, I think, maybe watery, light blue, sky blue. And then maybe 4 or 5 dips in the vat gets you something on the right side, like these deep navy blues. But this is kind of one of the reasons why I love indigo so much, is just that you can build that color by way of multiple dips in the vat. There's also different types of executions. So again, on the left side, creating these smaller detailed patterns using something as simple as a clothespin. In the center here, some examples of some other shibori clamping methods that I've done with larger wooden boards to create some of these diamond shapes or these radial floral patterns. I also love being able to combine indigo with other colors. And so this example here with the red, yellow, blue, that fabric has been treated with mordant, has been pre-mordanted already in order to take on that red and yellow color. But the indigo is sort of the bottom-most layer of that. But I love being able to combine and try to create that full spectrum. So I think indigo blue is this really beautiful addition to some of my natural dye work, because it kind of helps create some of those other colors. So not just having yellow, but being able to create shades of green, or not just having red, but being able to layer it and get shades of purple. So blue just adds that like extra element and really creating like a full spectrum within the natural dye world. On the right side here, I want to show an example of using the indigo vat, but also with a different technique of pattern making. It's called, or it's using rice resist. So in this method, as I mentioned earlier, how we build deeper shades of blue by layering and adding more dips, or doing more dips in the vat. That is also in conjunction with adding different layers of rice resist using a stencil. So this piece was inspired by an Annie Albers weaving. And what I really wanted to explore is how many shades of blue can I get in one piece, but also how many different layers of pattern can I get into that piece. So I used a plastic stencil, a rice paste, which is just created from rice flour that's blended down into almost like a glue-like solution. And it's applied with that stencil. And every dip into the vat, I would add another layer of rice resist. So that's how we get these multiple shades and varying patterns within one piece. So I'm really excited to talk about it today, because I think that indigo just has so many wonderful different ways that you can apply it to textiles. And just wanted to give you a sense of how many different types of executions there are, whether it's just, simply putting it straight into the vat, or combining it with other colors, or using some sort of surface design technique to create something like the piece on the right side. So to start from the very beginning, what is indigo? It is a pigment from the leaves of the indigo plant. and it's one of the oldest dyes known to humankind. So earlier when I was talking about the plant from my garden, someone asked, is it in the stems? Is it in the flowers? It's all actually in these gorgeous deep green leaves. The process that we're talking about today is the 123 mineral vat. There are many different ways to create an indigo vat. Again, the type that we're talking about today is specifically a mineral vat. However, there are other types of vats that you can create. You can create a slow fermentation vat using organic materials. You can do a quick alkaline reduction with sugars, with like fruit sugars. Again, the one that we're talking about is a mineral reduction. It's something that was introduced by a dyer named Michelle Garcia. The reason that I rely on the mineral vat is because the mineral vat, can live at a relatively like neutral room temperature. It's very easy to maintain. Something like a sugar vat, for example, or a fermentation vat really requires a lot of nuance, a lot of daily maintenance, coming back to your vat to check in regularly to make sure that, I guess similar to, the idea of like a sourdough starter or a kombucha, it really requires nurturing on a regular basis. Temperature is very important for things like a fermentation vat or a sugar vat. The amount of alkaline agent in it really matters. The mineral vat is, on the other hand, is very low maintenance. I can leave that and come back to it, and typically it'll still be functioning without having me checking in on a regular basis. So I really love the mineral vat. It's also really nice because I live in DC. The temperature, climate is constantly changing. I can have it outside, I can bring it inside, and it will function really well in whatever particular environment that I have, indoor or outdoors. I really recommend it because of how low maintenance it is, and I think it's a really nice introductory style of indigo vat. You'll notice that I mentioned like a fermentation vat, a sugar vat, a mineral vat. The vats are actually named after the reduction agent, and so in this mineral vat, it is a mineral that is used to reduce the indigo to a usable state. So in the mineral vat, what we need to start with is, it's called a 123 vat. What we need to start with is the indigo powder. So here I have a bag of plant-derived indigo powder. I wanted to, here we are. You can see that it looks blue. I also will be using 100 grams of ferrous sulfate. Ferrous sulfate is otherwise known as iron powder. So iron powder is something that is commonly used for dyers as a darkening or a saddening agent. So it'll typically turn, let's say, a marigold dyed piece, which is yellow. If I put it into an iron solution, it will shift that color to, or sadden that color to, an olive color. And so it's used really commonly in textile or in natural dyes as a saddening color modifier. In this particular instance with indigo in the mineral vat, it's used as the reduction agent. So this is what is going to turn this powder into a usable form that will fix to your fabric. The last thing that we're going to use is calcium hydroxide. So calcium hydroxide is slaked lime. It's pretty common. You can find it at the hardware store. You can find it at your any large hardware store. And I think even sometimes you can find it in your grocery store because it's also known as pickling lime. I'm not a pickler. I've never pickled anything ever, but I know that a lot of people are familiar with this. And so you can find this in your grocery store. So we're talking about the ingredients that go into a mineral vat. It's a simple 1, 2, 3. And the reason it's called a 1, 2, 3 is, I don't know if you noticed in the presentation, the fact that the proportions are simply 1, 2, 3. So what we're doing is using 1 part indigo extract, indigo powder, 2 parts ferrous sulfate, and 3 parts calcium hydroxide. It's a really awesome and straightforward approach to making an indigo vat, to making a mineral vat. And I think it's been really awesome just because I'm terrible at math and this becomes like a very easy way to remember. So 1 part indigo powder, 2 parts ferrous sulfate, and 3 parts calcium hydroxide. Oh, yes.
And we have a question in the chat.
Yes.
How much water should you use in the vat?
This is a great question. So what I typically use for this amount, these proportions, is a 5-gallon plastic bucket. So that is, the ones that you find at the hardware store that are typically for like painting. I'll show it in a moment. It's right behind me, actually. It's just one of these 5-gallon generic buckets.
And is a mineral vat good for all fibers, or are there specific types of fibers you should be using with this method?
That is a great question. So because for those of you who know about iron, the amount of iron that we're using to create this vat is a very large amount. It's a lot. And that means that it is not as good for certain types of fabric. So silk, for example, is not necessarily recommended for this type of vat because that high amount of iron being exposed to something as delicate as silk really makes that silk brittle. So this type of mineral vat is actually very good for cellulose-based fibers. That works for me because I really love working with cotton. I really love working with linen. I really love working with bamboo. And so the cellulose fibers are just a bigger part of my practice. If you're someone that likes to work with protein fibers, so silk and wool, for example, this may not be the right vat for you. It may actually be something more like a sugar vat. And so I think that's a really great consideration because although this mineral vat is super easy, low maintenance, it is generally recommended to use just cellulose fibers. So I want to talk a little bit about why we're making a vat or how it differs from other natural dye processes. So I know that we said 70% of the people here are more in the beginner level of natural dye. So to give you a quick rundown, the way that natural dye process typically works is really simple. You clean your fabric, you scour your fabric, you prep your fabric in a mordant. So that's called pre-mordanting. Pre-mordanting is basically putting your fabric into a chemical solution, and those chemicals allow the dye to fix to the fabric. And then the way you extract the dye from something like marigold, for example, is you put the marigold flowers into a pot of hot water, you let it simmer, almost like making a tea or a broth, and then you add that pre-mordanted fabric into the dye, right? So it's really simple 3 steps of dyeing. Indigo does not work that way. If I were to take these leaves and boil them or put them to a simmer in a pot and then add pre-mordanted fabric, nothing happens. That pigment is in an insoluble state and will not form a bond with the fabric. So the whole process of making a vat is to turn this insoluble pigment into a soluble form that will actually attach to your fabric. And so that's the whole premise of an indigo vat. That's the whole premise of a reduction agent, and that's why indigo is so special, because it has a very unique process of extraction that differs from other natural dyes. So I think we can jump into, my water's boiling next to me, so I feel like it's time to jump into how we actually make a vat.
And I have a quick textile follow-up question, and I'm going to jump in to remind you to mute your notifications. I think when we rejoined, we got notifications back.
Oh, yes.
So follow up to the textile is, can you use raw silk in a mineral vat as it is thicker in its weave?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. I do love raw silk because it has, I don't know if slubs are the right word, but because it has that texture, and I know what you're talking about, it's thicker and seems a little bit more like hardy or something. I've never actually used it. And let me backtrack by saying that, you know, it's not recommended to use silk and protein fibers and wool in mineral vats. That being said, I know dyers who do it because, in the short term, if they're doing a very short dip in the vat, I feel like they have not seen such negative impacts on the fabric. And so, what I really recommend is just you trying it out yourself and seeing how much you're willing to give of that silk sheen. So when I've put my silk into the mineral vat, for example, I noticed coming out that it's just slightly rougher. It's slightly less shiny than silk tends to be. And for me, that might be okay. For you, you might be unhappy with that slight change in the texture of the fabric. The raw silk being thicker and a little bit more textured could potentially work. But it is just sort of how you like your fabric to lay and how you like the feeling of it. So I can't really say for sure, but I think it's sort of a personal preference. In the long term, like I think doing multiple dips of silk in the mineral vat can cause long-term damage, but in the short term, maybe it's not as big of a deal. Okay, I noticed that I have indigo on my face, so that will happen to you too if you start using it. It just keeps rubbing in. If you start using indigo at home. Okay, so I want to talk about how we make an indigo vat. What we're starting with is something called a starter or a mother. So in order to start the vat, we're actually working on a much smaller scale. We're working with a small pot. This is maybe a 6-quart pot, a 4 to 6-quart pot. I have just a little bit of water in here. About half the pot is full of water and it's simmering. What I'm going to do is my kitchen scale, which is very important in the dye process. Definitely recommend having, this is a must-have in a natural dye studio, is having a baking scale that works in grams. I'm going to measure out my indigo powder. For the purposes of today, I'm going to just do about 20 grams just because I already have a working vat. And what I'll do typically in these types of classes is if I have a vat that is fully, at its prime, has all the indigo, is fresh, I will make this as a demo. And then after dyeing multiple garments, I will put this into the vat at the end of the session and sort of refresh my vat. Okay, so I'm going to measure out 20 grams. Okay, I have 20 grams here. And this indigo comes from a place called Stony Creek. They're based in Kentucky, and they're a really incredible resource for natural indigo. It's really awesome because I think they approach growing indigo with a very scientific mindset. And so what they've done is they grow all of it locally, and they also have tried to produce indigo that has different types of yield of the blue pigment. And so they have like a medium yield and like a higher yield of indigo powder. And I think I've used both before, but they're really, really wonderful producer of indigo here, close. I mean, I'm in DC, so it's not that close, but close-ish. So I have 20 grams of the indigo powder here. To give you a sense, here it is. It's about half of this cup, of this measuring cup. I'm going to put it into my simmering water. I'm then going to measure out, so that's one part indigo, the two parts ferrous sulfate. That means 40 grams of ferrous sulfate. One thing I want to remind everyone is when they're measuring things out, to tear their scale when you put the measuring cup on, just to make sure so that your numbers are not off, because there are many times where I haven't teared my scale and have ended up with unfortunate results. Okay, so now I have 2 parts ferrous sulfate, which makes 40 grams. You can see the powder here. I'll add that to the pot. The last part here is the slaked lime. And a note about using calcium hydroxide is that the powder is a very fine powder. I have a window right here. My space is large and it's ventilated. And typically I make these vats outside in my outdoor garden. This powder has the effect of sort of like powdered sugar when you open the bag and the powder just sort of poof into the air. It has that. So when you're doing this, make sure that you have a well-ventilated space, that you, or wear a mask. I have the window, so I'm gonna try and not breathe in. Thankfully these days, I think it's been so nice out that I can do this outside, and I highly recommend that if you can. So we're using calcium hydroxide, and that is going to be 3 parts. So I did 20 grams of indigo, 40 grams of ferrous sulfate, and now I'll do 60 grams of the calcium hydroxide. That comes out to be about a full cup. So it's almost filled this to the top. I'm going to add that to this small pot of simmering water. And then you can't see it. I'll lift it up in a moment when it's reached its, when it's all mixed in together. But I'm going to just mix it with my measuring cup and make sure that it all gets worked in. So with all of that amount of powder and all of the materials that we just used, it creates kind of this sludgy mixture in this pot. I have this enamel pot that's dedicated to making indigo starters or mothers, and I just reuse the same pot over and over again because it starts to build, especially using the iron, the ferrous sulfate, it starts to sort of build up some layers of residue in there. The smell, I can tell you, is it's a very unique smell to this. I can't ever describe it, but it is a very strong, again, another reason to have a very well ventilated space. Also, having a dedicated pot. We are not combining this pot with food pots. This is not a soup pot. I never eat out of this. That's a best practice for dyeing. I just tend to not overlap my dye materials and tools with my food materials and tools. Okay, so I'm mixing all of this together, and I want to describe to you the way it looks. What's happening is it's building or it's creating this coppery sheen at the top of the liquid. And I can move my camera so that you can see it shortly. So I want to show you the way it's looking. You can see it has that coppery bronze look to it. And it's bubbling, so I'm going to turn the water down, the heat down just a little bit. Also, so you see I have a tabletop burner. These are really convenient for the particular way my studio is set up, especially because I don't have a kitchen on this level. And so it's really nice to have these tabletop heat sources. I'm going to turn the water down or the heat down a little bit so it's simmering. But you can see that it's created this bronzy, beautiful layer on top. And what's happening here is we've added the ferrous sulfate, we've added the the calcium hydroxide, and that is going to create and reduce the indigo pigment from an insoluble form into a soluble form. So that's essentially what's happening. Again, we're just trying to transform that pigment, that indigo pigment, into a state that will actually fix to the fabric.
And when you're working with a full-sized batch of indigo, do you use a smaller amount of water first on the stove and then mix it into a larger amount of water, or are you working with the full amount of water in the pot?
Yeah, that's a good question. So every time I'm starting, so for example, my ultimate goal is this 5-gallon vat. I will always start small with maybe like 1 gallon of water, half a gallon of water to make that starter. I would then, let's say I'm starting a fresh vat. Let's assume this is empty. I would do my 50 grams of indigo, my 100 grams of ferrous sulfate, my 150 grams of calcium hydroxide in about the 1 gallon of water in this small pot. I would add this into my larger vessel once it's all mixed and cooked down. I would add it into my large 5-gallon bucket, really carefully put it in, like pour it into the bottom of the bucket. And then from there, I'll add and fill the bucket to the 5-gallon capacity. So we're always going to work on the smaller scale, always work on the smaller vessel, the smaller pot, because A, we need that temperature to help with that chemical reaction. And B, it's just much easier to transport this into the vat and then add hot water. Again, the water, if you notice, like dyeing is a very, can be a very specific and very almost like baker's structured, like very precise with the quantities, the amounts of ingredients. But I also tend to be more of a loose person. I feel like I describe myself as like a chef in the natural dye kitchen. And so sometimes I'll take liberties with some of the amounts or the processes. So, typically you would want to fill, if I put the starter into the bucket, you would typically want to fill the rest of it with hot water. I have definitely taken liberties with that and done cold water to the top and have still had a successful final result. So I think just doing whatever works best for you is good. But I'm going to transfer over to the vat now and show you what the vat looks like and dye a piece for you so you can see that whole transformation. So again, just to recap, we have made this mother, the starter, the indigo starter, with the 1, 2, 3 mineral vat formula. This has created that coppery sheen. And I also want to show you actually really quickly, if I can, you remember that coppery bronzy top. And then we also have a look at the actual liquid, which, let me fill it more. Which it might be hard to see on the camera. Yeah, it might be hard. But if you were to look closely at the liquid itself, and I probably have I wonder if I have a glass jar. One moment, I can pull a glass jar and then you can see the actual liquid color. Here, this is a plastic container. But you can see that the liquid, or maybe you can't, is kind of a brown color. And that means that the indigo has reduced. And so what we start off with, which is a blue powder extract from the plant, gets reduced in this small pot, and then transforms into this brownish liquid. And that means that it's reduced and can be used to dye with now.
About how long does that usually take? This seemed quite quick.
Yeah, that reaction happens quite quickly. The heat helps with that reaction. This typically is like 20 minutes at most. And I'll let that sit while I dye things. And at the end of my dyeing session, I'll add it in. So it's a very quick process. Once you add this into the vat, though, once you're starting to make your vat, you have to let that sit for a few hours for the reaction to continue in the larger amount of water, though. So, for example, if I were to make my mother, if this is my beginning of the vat, I put this into my bucket. I fill the bucket to the top with my 5 gallons of water. I'll give it a really big stir. And there's a very specific kind of stirring with your indigo vat where it's larger motions, sort of like you're almost, I guess, appropriate for Halloween, almost like a witch. Like you're like stirring your big vat, and you're trying to create a cyclone at the center. And you let that sit for a few hours before you can actually start working in the vat. So there is a little bit of sitting time once it goes into the larger vessel. Okay, so I want to show, this is a dangerous part of here where I have my bucket, my indigo vat balanced on a stool. So wish me luck. I hope I don't knock it over. Okay, so this is my indigo vat. Again, it's a 5 gallon painter's bucket that you just get at the hardware store. It's clearly had lots of use because you can see all the indigo all around it. Right now, you can't see it, but the water level is about 3 inches below the lip. One of the things that I like to do, because these vats are so heavy, and this is just like a tip in terms of if you have this in your home or outside, is I always purchase the they are like the planter, the trays with wheels underneath of them. I think they're typically for like really large plants, house plants. And I'll put my vat on those with wheels so I can move the vat around easily. And that's just something in terms of like making it easier for you at home if you're trying to work with something so large. Because it becomes really heavy, and with all that liquid sloshing around, it's really hard to navigate sometimes around your space. So I always try and put it onto one of those things with wheels so that I can move it easily. So again, this has about water filled to about 3 inches from the lip. The important thing to know is, so I had mentioned that the starter is quite sludgy and has a lot of residue. It's kind of like a thick material, a thick substance, I should say. When it goes into the vat, and if this is the first time I've ever made a vat, if I fill it to the top with water, I stir it with the stick. The reason that you need the time, like let's say the hour or 2 hours before you start dyeing, is because all of that material, all of that solid substance needs to settle back down into the bottom of the vat. So if this is my full vat, there you go. The bottom 3 inches or 4 inches, let's say, has all of those thicker substances. And you want to make sure that when you're dyeing your piece, that your piece doesn't fall down into that sludge, because that's going to create areas of residue on your piece. So it's really important when you're dyeing to only dye in like that small working space. So it's probably about up down to about 4 inches, 3 or 4 inches below the bottom of the vat. So just keeping that in mind when you are working. So I want to show you, again, the blues are built through layers of dipping and numbers of dips. Again, what we've done is we've made the insoluble pigment, we've reduced it and turned it into a soluble state, right? So what that means is, as I'm dyeing it, I want to show you the transformation. So if you look here closely, let me try and get it into the light. You can kind of see that it's green and it's transforming into blue right as we pull it out. I don't know if you noticed that transition. I have another piece of fabric that I could show that. That green liquid is the indigo that has become a soluble form. And as I pull it out and it exposes to the air, the oxygen is re-entering the piece, and it is transforming that pigment from the soluble into the insoluble blue. So it's a really awesome chemical reaction. All the science behind it is really fascinating to me, and the fact that you can sort of see the color go from this green to a blue is really, really, really amazing. I think that's why people find or have found this process so awesome and keep gravitating to it over and over again. I can show you at the bottom here. You can see the green. Elizabeth, can you tell that it's green turning to blue?
I can see a little bit of the range of a greener teal down near the tip of the fabric up to the more blue.
Yeah. I hope that translates over the video. So I've just given it, typically what I'll do is I'll dip my piece in the vat for the first dip is about 30 seconds to a minute, sometimes longer. But I'll do at least 30 seconds or a minute. I'll take this and put it into a bowl of water and agitate it in the water. Water obviously has lots of oxygen, and so that sort of accelerates the oxidation process. The oxidation process in between dips is as crucial as it is one of the most crucial parts, I think, of dyeing with indigo. It's something that I have learned over time to be patient, because in order for that blue to really fix into the fabric, you really need to let that oxidation process happen. And that can be between 10 minutes to 20 minutes. Visually, you can see it. The cue has all of the green transformed into blue on your piece. And that's a good visual indicator. However, I think time is just your best bet with that oxidation process, and really letting the fabric sit and exposed to the air for 10 to 20 minutes in between every single dip. What that allows is for the blue to fix into the fabric, and it causes a lot less cracking. Cracking is something that happens with indigo naturally. It's common. I think it really happens like regardless. It's where the blue kind of rubs off onto other things. But with that proper oxidation process in between, oxidation time in between, you can really minimize that cracking effect.
And is there such a thing as leaving it too long during that 10 to 20 minutes? Like, what if you left it 40?
No, I don't think there's anything. I don't think that there would be too long of oxidation. I think you're only benefiting yourself, benefiting the piece. And I would say that, right now I'm working with a piece of fabric that's open. It's just a bandana that is loose. Typically, I will do shibori techniques. I'll fold and clamp my pieces. And because I've folded so many layers, that oxidation process becomes even longer. So those 40 minutes are actually really crucial, because the fabric has been folded so tightly and bound that it takes a lot longer for the oxygen to penetrate. It takes longer for the dye to penetrate in the vat, so I would probably keep it in the vat longer. And B, it takes a longer oxidation time. So I want to dye one more piece so that hopefully you can see that transformation of green. And maybe I'll do it on just the bottom of the piece so you can see. So my white fabric, I'm just going to dip it. And again, because it's just one long piece of fabric, I'm going to make sure not to let it fall to the bottom where all of that sludgy material is, and really just make sure it doesn't agitate all of that residue, because that kind of kind of ruins your working space of the indigo. Okay, so I'm just going to dip it really quick in the bottom. Here, I think you can kind of see the transformation of that green to blue, and you can see it very much at the bottom. What I'm doing right now, you don't want to do this. The way I'm letting it drip back into the vat um, is a no. But just for the purposes of this demo, I want you to see that. The reason you don't want to let the liquid fall back into the vat like this is because what's happened is now that I've pulled it out, oxygen has penetrated all of this liquid, and you're essentially letting oxidized material fall back into the vat, and that is reoxidizing the vat, which is what you don't want to do. You want the vat to remain reduced and not ruin it with the oxygen being entered into it. But just to give you a sense of it, here's the green again, and you can kind of see it transform to blue. So it's really an awesome process. I'm going to let this sit in here for a little bit longer. The way that you want to dye your pieces is, again, because we don't want to introduce oxygen into the vat, we want to be careful with that and not agitate the surface. And so what we do, and I'm not wearing gloves, I highly recommend wearing gloves. I always forget my gloves. But what you want to do is keep your garment or your fabric below the surface of the indigo vat and massage the fabric underneath the surface, being really gentle at the top. Again, oxygen we don't want into the vat, so we want to be as gentle as possible. So I'm just letting it move around. I'm working it around my hands underneath the surface. What I typically do is I would squeeze out all the liquid underneath the surface of the vat and pull it out so that I'm not letting it drip back in. And I'm going to move it over to my water bucket to agitate.
And while you're agitating, I have a couple of questions for you.
Please.
So you sort of addressed this, but will the indigo clean away from your hands easily?
Yes. So I have found some tricks to cleaning the indigo off my hands, which they are so blue now. You can see. You can use like a loofah or any kind of scrubber, and I will notice that helps accelerate the indigo coming out. But I tend to live with this for maybe about 2 or 3 days, maybe 4 days sometimes. And I've just gotten used to people asking questions about my blue hands.
Will the indigo fabrics stain other things at this stage? And as a sort of follow up, when does the color become fast, or how does it become fast?
Yeah, okay, that's a great question because people want to know that about, when you're working with the indigo powder, for example, will that dye your clothes? In the insoluble state, it will not affect my clothes. In this state, if this vat splashes onto me, everything will turn blue and dye blue. It's when it is in this powder form. If I were to mix this powder with water and that's it might stain my clothes. It might cause temporary. I could wear all white and work with indigo powder mixed with water. It'll stain my clothes, but it'll wash out because it hasn't gone through that chemical reaction yet and hasn't become soluble state. Anything in the mother state or in here, once it's been combined with the reduction agent and the alkaline material, it will stain your clothes. So be careful with it. But I wore all blue for that purpose so that it could re-dye my blue clothes.
And so once you have it, you've agitated it, and perhaps it's drying. Is there anything you need to do to help it become fast so that it is not, once it's dry, is it going to transfer to other things?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the crocking, that's what we talked about earlier. I mentioned it earlier. Indigo will naturally crock. I think regardless of like what types of ways that you treat it, that crocking can be minimized though by the oxidation. At the end of this process, after we have dyed it, and let's say I'm happy with the shade of blue that I have, what I would do is rinse it in very, very, very hot water. And that hot water kind of is a part of the curing process and kind of helps cure that color in my piece. So that's one step that you can take. A second step that you can take is, I know some dyers will treat their indigo dyed pieces in a soy milk solution. And apparently that helps with like the UV rays, exposure to UV rays, and helps mitigate the fading and some of that light fastness and color fastness. It helps those with those two. I've not done the soy milk treatments post indigo dyeing, but I would be curious if anyone does do that, how successful it is for them in terms of the rubbing off and light fast color fastness properties.
You mentioned that the fabric you were working with had been somewhat treated. Are they wet when you dip them into the bath, or are you starting with something dry?
That's a really great question. So, in other dye processes, I mentioned that we scour the fabric and we pre-mordant the fabric. With indigo, all we're doing is scouring the fabric. So scouring is like a deep cleaning of your fiber, because a lot of fiber, specifically cellulose fiber, has a lot of residue on it and has like a waxy filament that exists from the plant and also the processing. And so scouring really helps to remove all of that residue from your piece. The way that I scoured my cellulose pieces is by putting my fiber into a simmering pot of water that has soda ash in it, and cooking it down for about 30 minutes. Alternatively, if you don't have that time or ability, you can also put it in a hot wash in your washing machine with a neutral detergent. You don't want to use something you don't want to use any of those like heavier scented detergents, because that will also add a layer of residue to your piece. So the answer is yes, these have been scoured. And also with regards to the question of was it wetted out, these pieces were wetted out. So they were sitting in a bowl of water to wet out all of the the molecules of the fiber. You want to make sure that your piece is wetted out, but not dripping wet. So before putting your fabric into the vat, you want to squeeze all of that water out and make sure that it is damp but not dripping with water, because again, that water has oxygen. That oxygen will turn this vat into the insoluble state, and so we don't want to do that. But yes, working with a wetted out piece will be helpful to help the dye penetrate all of the fiber.
Okay, we have one last question, and then I want to make sure you have a chance to share how people can reach out to you and if you have any other resources you want to share. So, do you ever need to re-stir the vat?
Yeah, and so that's a good question. So, let's assume that I am done with my dye process. I've dyed my 50 bandanas, let's say. Let me grab my stirring stick. At the end of my dye session, I want to reactivate my vat. So again, we talked about that the 4 inches at the bottom that all of that sludgy material has fallen down to. Now that the vat has been used, we want to reactivate it and get those chemicals back up and reactivate that reduction process. So what I'm going to do is, I mentioned that like stirring process. So I'm trying to do like larger circular stirs on the exterior of my vat, and then really trying to get everything worked up the center and getting all of that all of those chemicals back up through my vat. And I don't know if I'll be able to show you. But here we are. You can see there's a flower on top called a flower, which is just the area of bubbles on top. And I don't think it's translating in the video, but you can see that the liquid is actually green. So it's not dark blue. It's like a greenish color because of the reduction that's happened. So now that I'm done working, I've stirred my vat. I'm going to let this rest, and tomorrow I can return to it and use it again.
Great. Thanks so much. Are there additional resources you'd like to share that are at the end of your presentation?
I don't have a list, but I can name some really awesome dyers and resources that I highly recommend as you dive into indigo. The first, hands down, my hands are blue, hands down, the number one resource for dyeing is The Art and Science of Natural Dyes by Catherine Ellis and Joy Boutrup. They recently wrote this book. Maybe it's been about 2 years now. 2 or 3 years ago it came out, and it is the number one resource and textbook on dye processes. I love it because it goes into the science of dyeing pretty in depth. So if you're a chemistry person, it'll sort of break that down for you in a very scientific way. But it also has a ton of recipes at the end of it, and really walks you through all the different ways that you could approach an indigo vat, or approach mordanting, or approach scouring. And so it's a really wonderful resource. Highly recommend that book. I also think that looking into Roland Ricketts, he's a awesome indigo dyer. I think he's in Indiana, has a farm and works with Japanese indigo, has a really great series of resources online. I also recommend Botanical Colors. Kathy Hattori is a wonderful person. She has tons of great resources online that are very informative and clear and walk you through the process. So highly recommend her site. And then also Graham Keegan, who is a dyer out in LA, who just has so much information and knowledge about dyeing, and also puts it on his website. So all of those are great resources as you explore natural dye, and particularly indigo. And those are some great places to start, I think.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. So, thank you all for attending today. That concludes our program.